We are going to dive back into the essay that we have been working our way through the last couple of weeks, the first chapter of Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Prophets, an essay called What Manner of Man is the Prophet, which comes from his original doctoral work that he did in the 1930s in Germany, and that he credits with the awakening of his social conscience, the transition from centering his life in the study to finding his purpose together with interfaith leaders on the streets working in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, and in many other movements for social change, deeply grounded in his Jewish learning and in his understanding of the role of the prophets. We are going to dive back into that essay that we have been talking about bit by bit, and look at some new sections of it. If you could give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen. Thank you so much. I've learned I needed to do that. When early in the Zoom days, I taught a 2-hour Intro to Judaism class from a PowerPoint, or at least I thought I did, and everybody was too polite to tell the rabbi that for 2 hours I had been gesturing to slides that weren't on the screen. So now I ask for a thumbs up just to indicate that people can actually see. This is where we've been these first few pages, talking about what manner of man is the prophet, talking about the distinction that Heschel makes between philosophical questions and prophetic questions, philosophical questions being generally abstract, questions about meaning, about being and becoming, definitions and demonstrations. And says the prophet doesn't have any time for that. The prophet is interested in taking us not to the elegant mansions of the mind, but to the slums, taking us to the place where people are in most deep need, where there is the greatest vulnerability, and that's where God is announcing a message. And the message, as Heschel articulates it, is a message which is a message of ferocious consciousness, of being awake and aware, and refusing to go numb to things which are unacceptable, refusing to adjust to a world in which some will make do without the basic needs to survive, a world in which we just get used to things being the way they are rather than continuing to aspire to the way that they ought to be. And we talked at the end of last class about the role of God in all this. And the last paragraph of this section, I'll read it out loud. The prophet is a man who feels fiercely. God has thrust a burden upon his soul, and he is bowed and stunned by man's fierce greed. Frightful is the agony of man. No human voice can convey its terror. Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to that silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. It is a form of living, a crossing point of God and man. God is raging, in the prophet's words. We talked about what does God have to do with this? And we talked about different ways of understanding God. Some of us understanding God as a personified figure, a parent figure, a sovereign figure who looks down and on us and is disappointed by what that God sees, and who, through God's prophets, through God's mouthpieces in the world, announces a message of disappointment, that the children are not better behaved, don't treat each other better. We also talked about the idea that God doesn't have to be personified in that way, that God could be the name we give to the still small voice, to the conscience, to the sense of true moral north, to the idea that there is such a thing as right and wrong in the world, that we're not living in a chaos of total relativism, that it is possible to say that justice is real and it applies to all of us. It is possible to say that it is worth it to strive for compassion and equity and goodness, even when the world doesn't reward those things nearly as it should. And we talked about the prophetic calling as a calling to heed that voice, that divine voice, that still small voice, that voice of conscience and awareness. We're going to start the next section that's called, I love this title, The Importance of Trivialities. The importance of trivialities. You would think that's a little bit of an oxymoron, right? If something is trivial, then it is by definition not important. But Heschel wants us to know that the prophets have a different reckoning of what is meaningful and what is trivial than perhaps the rest of us. Human affairs are hardly worth considering in earnest, and yet we must be earnest about them. A sad necessity constrains us, says Plato in a mood of melancholy. It's said that all of Western philosophy is just footnotes on Plato. Plato is the granddaddy of philosophical thinking. He says human affairs are hardly worth considering in earnest. But what can we do? We're human. We have to talk about these earthly things. He apologizes later for his low opinion of mankind, which he explains emerged from comparing men with the gods. Let us grant, if you wish, that the human race is not to be despised, but is worthy of some consideration. How nice of the philosopher to say we are worthy of some consideration. The gods attend to great matters. They neglect small ones, Cicero maintains, Roman philosopher. According to Aristotle, the gods are not concerned at all with the dispensation of good and bad fortune or external things. So Heschel is starting by setting up the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition that underlies all of the Western philosophical tradition, which has a generally, he says, dismissive attitude toward the importance of humanity and of human things, and a preference for focusing on things of universal or divine significance, things which are perfect or outside of the sullied world that we live in. Plato says, it would be better if we didn't have to talk about human things. But what can we do? And we can see that Platonic idea being echoed in St. Paul, who says it would be better if nobody married and made families, and we lived in perfect contemplation of God and perfect celibacy. But what can we do? We have to give in to the weakness of the flesh. Right? Pauline theology that underlies much of Christianity is a Neoplatonic philosophy. It is a philosophy that says there is body and there is spirit, and body is weak and sinful, and spirit is ethereal and pure. And because we live in bodies, we have to attend to bodies, but we should never get too comfortable in our bodies. We should be in the world, but not of the world. Heschel says this kind of bifurcation between the world in which we live and the spirit world, and this preferencing of the perfect spiritual realm over the earthy, very imperfect realm, is entirely foreign to the way that the prophets see the world. I'm in the middle of that second paragraph. To the prophet, however, no subject is as worthy of consideration as the plight of man. Indeed, God himself is described as reflecting over the plight of man rather than contemplating eternal ideas. God doesn't sit up in heaven thinking deep thoughts. God is, the God that we read about in the Bible, intimately interested in the lives of a collection of trivial desert nomads who are subject to all sorts of family dysfunctions before they wind up enslaved in Egypt, becoming lower than nobodies. And God, in God's heaven, cares about these little tiny ants. In fact, that's the primary thing on God's mind. Heschel's greatest work of theology is a book called God in Search of Man. That's interesting as a title. Right? We are familiar with the concept that we are in search of God. And Heschel wrote a book called Man's Quest for God. Heschel recognized that we yearn for God, but what Heschel added to the conversation is a depiction of a God who yearns for us. A God who has, in Heschel's words, pathos, a God who wants and wishes and desires, a God with FOMO, with fear of missing out, a God who isn't content to just be off in God's heaven, but wants to be intimately involved in the life of us down here on earth. God's mind is preoccupied with man, with the concrete actualities of history, rather than the timeless issues of thought. In the prophet's message, nothing that has bearing upon good and evil is small or trite in the eyes of God. You might think that God, being eternal and universal, and so many orders of magnitude bigger than us that it's impossible to fully articulate, that God would have no interest whatsoever in human problems, except the prophets say, God is tremendously interested in the suffering of a particular widow who doesn't have enough to eat, or a particular orphan who has no one to care for her. God is directly interested in the plight of the stranger and of the vulnerable in society. And that's scandalous, because God should have bigger things on God's mind. But in fact, the prophets say, this is how God works. And this passage calls us to a passage later in the book, page 363. Don't worry, we're not going to work through this essay till we get to page 363. But I brought it for us because it's quite lovely, and we'll use it to have some conversation. I'm going to make this bigger. Heaven and the Marketplace. Mysticism, born in a longing for a world beyond this world, strives for a perception of timeless reality. It flourishes in a soul for which the world, with its petty troubles and cares, does not deserve mention. Mysticism is the branch of any religious tradition that is interested in penetrating through the veil and having a direct experience of the divine. There are Christian mystics going as far back as the 1st century and 2nd century desert fathers, early Christian monastics living off on their own in little desert huts in the Sinai, meditating on God. There are Muslim mystics, there are Hindu mystics, and there is Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And what all mystics have in common is this sense that there is a world beyond the world that we see, beyond what we can see, hear, taste, or touch, a deeper reality that's hidden behind the veil of this world. Heschel, his formal title at the Jewish Theological Seminary, was professor of mysticism and ethics. Heschel knows what he's talking about when he's talking about mysticism. A mystic, he says, is born in a longing for a world beyond this world, who desires to see through the veil and to get in touch with what's really essential, which is hidden from the eye. And he gives us a quote here from Plotinus. Life here with the things of this earth is a sinking, a defeat, a failing of the wing. Our good is there. This is the idea that the soul gets trapped. It gets anchored here in the world. And the soul's purpose is to escape from the prison of the flesh, from the prison of this world, to return back to its heavenly home. The things of this earth is a sinking, it's a defeat, a failing of the wing. The soul that wants to fly is stuck, is trapped in the mud and mire. Our good is there, not here. How many of us have encountered religious people who have taught or believed the message that what happens in this world really isn't very important? that really what happens in this world is only important to the extent that it prepares us for the true reality which comes after this life ends. That's a very popular religious position, that what's real is what's coming after this life, not this life. And then he talks about Aphrodite and such, whatever. You got the idea. In contrast, the prophet's field of concern is not the mysteries of heaven, but the affairs of the marketplace, not the spiritual realities of the beyond, but the life of the people, not the glories of eternity, but the blights of society. He addresses himself to those who trample upon the needy and destroy the poor of the land, who increase the price of grain, use dishonest scales, and sell the refuse of the corn. We read that passage from Amos. What the prophet's ear perceives is the word of God, but what the word contains is God's concern for this world. As the God of Israel is concerned with the here and now, the attention of the prophet is directed upon the social and political issues of the day. The mystic is absorbed in contemplation of the infinite. The prophet's eye scans the definite and finite, the insolence and hypocrisy of man, the little cruelties, the silly idolatries. This is why it's not enough for a prophet to be inspired by God. He must also be informed about the world. The world and its fate are very dear to him. There is no hostility to civilization, only to its abuses. Judaism does not, with very, very few exceptions, have a monasticism. There is no sustained effort within Jewish history, within the long arc of 3,000 years of Jewish history, of people going to live off by themselves, to remove themselves from the world in order to contemplate God. There are mystics who do have spiritual retreats, who take time by themselves in a finite set way. But the idea of entirely removing oneself from society as a path for getting close to God has never been a normative Jewish path. The prophet says, where do we find God? We find God in the world, not out of it. And so, in order to know about God, in order to engage in religion properly, we can't build a wall between us and the social and political realities of our day. That we can't be uninformed about what's going on out there in the world, closed off to what's going on out there in the world. Another way of saying this is what the Gemara, what the Talmud teaches, that it's forbidden to pray in a room that has no window. That it is forbidden to close oneself off from the world and say, I am in spiritual contemplation. I leave the world entirely outside. One can only enter into the sanctuary on the condition that one remains aware of what's going on beyond its walls. That doesn't mean that we can't have Shabbos. That doesn't mean that we can't have a break from the treadmill, from the exhaustion, from the craziness. But we can't be divorced from it, and we are not holier when we are disconnected from it. So I want to pause here and ask you what some of these ideas about engagement in the world rather than removal from the world, and the inability to create a clear distinction between the realm of God and the realm of the social and political. What does that raise up for you? And I want to just also name that this group is a group that is diverse in all sorts of ways. It is made up of CBI members and of folks who I got to know through the Intro to Judaism program, and my Bubby and Zadie in the Bronx, and some friends, all welcome. This group is diverse in its political orientation. There are people here of many different backgrounds and many different ideologies. I'm not interested here in how this idea reinforces what you or I believe to be true and ought to be a message in a spiritual space. But I am interested in how you relate to this idea broadly, that there isn't a distinction, at least according to Heschel and the prophets, between that which is spiritual and that which is of this world. You can use the raise hand feature. It's a great way to hop in. You can also just take yourself off mute and hop in the conversation. I've never known this group to be particularly shy.
This is Eric.
May I make a comment?
Somebody is speaking.
Oh,
Oh, fair enough.
Go
Well,
ahead.
just that there's sort of a controversy over what's life after death or eternal life. There is this soul that is somehow different, apart from the physical body, and that will go on to heaven or Garden Eden. And then there's the other is that the whole body will resurrect and maybe even go on to have more children. But in any case, all of animation is physical, and the way a mind can just change so radically through drugs or a tumor or some sort of horrible trauma that happens. It just seems as though the mind is very, very much a part of the body of the physical, and that there's there's no distinction to my mind.
And if we look at thank you, Eric. If we look at the early biblical sources on afterlife, we don't really find a spiritual afterlife concept. The Torah does not know about our souls going to live on the cloud, playing harps and bearing wings. The earliest conception of what happens after we die, Jewishly, is fully embodied. We go and lay at rest until such time as the coming of the Messiah, and then we wake up and go back to life in this world again. And for that reason, burial plots in the Mount of Olives cemetery in Jerusalem are still the most expensive Jewish burial plots in the world, because if you're resurrected, that means you're front of the line to go and offer your offerings in the temple. If you're resurrected in Costa Mesa, God forbid, you have to get to the other side of the world. And the line for the bathroom in the Beit HaMikdash is going to be obscene by that point, right? It is only when Greco-Roman thought enters into conversation with Jewish ideas that we get this idea of a soul that is entirely distinct from the physical body. This is, one could argue, not native thinking to Judaism, but rather an import that we borrow from Platonic thinking. And that if we look at what is most authentic and organic to Judaism, it is this much more earthy and earthly kind of understanding of who we are. Please, Aaron.
Kind of looking at the last or one of the last lines we read about that the prophet is directly or directed upon the social and political issues of the day. I recently was discussing with my brother the idea of, some people who don't want a rabbi to talk politics on the bima, and we were discussing that, some of that is fair, right? We don't want to say, oh, if you vote this way, you're not a good Jew. That's not how Judaism works, but that it's kind of disingenuous to say that we can separate politics and society from Jewish values, because if we're looking at how people are being treated, like we talked about last week about injustices in the world, that is political inherently, and it might be challenging to have those conversations, but like clearly Heschel feels that that you can't turn away from political issues. That's That's not how Judaism works. We can't be that comfortable. We have to be uncomfortable and look at those hard things that are happening in society.
And Heschel was something of a pariah in the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary for holding that position. There were many of his fellow professors who would have preferred that he not get himself involved and mixed up with the civil rights movement, and then certainly not with the anti-war movement, who felt that this was an inappropriate blending of politics and religion, and that he should stick to his lane, which was reading old books and talking about them, and let the activists stick to their lane. And Heschel said that because of the prophets, he couldn't do that. Because of the prophets, he couldn't, in good conscience, make a distinction between reading about how we're supposed to treat the poor and crafting a society that addresses the needs of the poor, or reading about how we are supposed to be living at peace and being part of a conversation about a society, a real society that struggles to live at peace. That the language, he would say, through which we live out our values, our religious values, is a political language. That is the language of how people relate to one another in society. And therefore, there is no meaningful distinction that one can point to. That's tricky in congregational life, let me tell you. I was just talking with a U.S. Wire, that's our teen youth program. They lead the Friday night service on the first Fridays of the month. And we were studying the Parsha together, this lovely 10th grader. And this Parsha is all about Moses handing over power to Aaron, the high priest. This is the only Parsha in which Moses' name doesn't get mentioned. And Aaron becomes the star of the show. And she said to me, she said, I think Moses does this because it's bad for any one person to have unchecked power. It's bad for power to be not, for somebody not to have somebody who can put a hand on his shoulder and say, you're going too far. She said, I would like to talk about what I see in the news, but I know I'm not allowed to do that. And I said, I'm not always allowed to do that, but you're a 10th grader. You can do whatever you want. So I'm curious to see what she's going to say, how she's going to interpret. But this idea of the rigidity of a distinction with religion on one side and politics and social issues on another is an idea that all of us who are in the religion business have to wrestle with. And Aaron, you referenced your brother, who is also a congregational rabbi. It's something we all have to wrestle with, that fine balance. Before I go to Avram, my Zadie wanted to share something, and far be it from me to talk over my Zadie.
Yes. I'm on.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I think that the activism is definitely prescribed by Heschel from the conversation that we've been having. And I think that to be a true believer in terms of what Heschel's philosophy is, that one has to not only live a life that is of this world, but they have to participate and bring their message to the right people. For example, if you have a crowd of people who are sitting around and they all agree in what's decent and honest and humane and so on. Some people will merely talk about it. But at a more significant level, there are those who will act upon it. They will spread the message of care and concern. They will demonstrate. They will write letters. They will contribute. They will actively participate in the process of making
Change.
making improvement at whatever level of government they can.
So, you know, when you were in college and you met somebody's parents and all of a sudden they made some sense? This is my Bubby and Zadie, ladies and gentlemen. My Bubby and Zadie in the Bronx, organizers of New York City Teachers Union. My mother's first memory is my Bubby pushing her in a stroller at a no nukes demonstration. My Bubby who was at the March on Washington. And if you can see up behind the two of them on the wall, you see a little tiny poster of Natan Sharansky. Both of them were diehard activists for Sylvia Jewelry. I have photos of one or the other of them being loaded into paddy wagons, being arrested outside of the Soviet embassy or mission. And one of them would get arrested and the other one would not, so that they could take the pictures. These are people who've been making change for close to, but not quite a century. And behind me, in my office, is their portrait with Sharansky holding that same poster that's up on their wall. So if you want to know where I draw a sense that it is important, exactly as my Zadie said, to be a loud voice for change, and to not just be the one in the crowd who is agitated, but the one in the crowd who is actively trying to make it better, to make, as Arlene said in the chat, some good trouble. I owe it to this pair. And there's a great many things I don't like about the modern world and the digital world in which we live. But the fact that I can learn every week with my Bubby and Zadie, thank you, Zoom. I appreciate it very much. My buddy Avram.
Thank you, Adam. So great to know your father and mother. Wow. Congratulations, you have a great son. Okay, I'm so grateful for this cause and grateful to Adam and really Heschel, really echo my journey. Why travel seems so important. Yeah, I'm Chinese. Okay, I'm a political dissident. Okay, Tiananmen Square. You know, the protest made 30 years ago, squashed by the government. So exactly, yeah. When it's a journey. If you don't touch the ground, you cannot bridge to the heaven. I think the prophet is exactly doing what, how to bring us to our region, to our God. That's my journey. If I don't have my moments, my suffering, struggling, agony in the life, daily life, I cannot bring me to find the Judaism. Such a long journey, and that's my feelings. I'm so happy, you know. I think Creator, Hashem brings so many prophets through the generations. Rabbi Adam is the kind of prophets for me. it's okay. When I try to find the meaning of life, find something higher, not in the traversing. We want to find, we are suffering here, then we find a place. When we can the answers, then we find the solution. Maybe can change from suffering to better. So that's, I think that's, Heschel trying to talk about why traversing is so important, how to sense the evil. And the word, there's a evil, there's a good. So we need to find what's good and what's wrong. And I think, everything is in the Torah. So that's my sharing. I want to grateful to Rabbi Adam bring me. I learned a lot from him, and I'm now a Jew for 5 years already in the past. So that's my share. Okay.
What an amazing collection of people who haven't just talked the talk, but walked the walk. We heard from Bubby and Zadie, the lifelong activists. We heard from my friend here, who together with his wife were student demonstrators in Tiananmen Square when the Chinese government rolled in with tanks. And one of their Havurah, one of their group stood in front of them, and we all saw that image. And there are so many heirs to the prophets. So many people in every generation and in every place who say, I feel fiercely the call, the demand of what I know to be good and true and right. And I can't silence my conscience. I need instead to let it guide me even to the scary place, even to the risky place. Thank you. Shall we read a little further? I am going to skip ahead. I think I told you that Heschel wrote on index cards. Each one of these little chapters is an index card, and sometimes they're a little repetitive. They're beautiful, but they're sometimes a little repetitive. So I'm going to skip ahead to this one. 1 octave too high. We and the prophet have no language in common. To us, the moral state of society, with all its stains and spots, seems fair and trim. To the prophet, it's dreadful. So many deeds of charity are done. So much decency radiates day and night. Yet to the prophet, satiety of the conscience is prudery and a flight from responsibility. Having a conscience which can be satisfied is, he says, unacceptable. Our conscience should never be satisfied. Our standards are modest, our sense of injustice tolerable, timid, our moral indignation impermanent. Yet human violence is interminable, unbearable, permanent. To us, life is often serene. In the prophet's eye, the world reels in confusion. The prophet makes no concession to man's capacity, exhibiting little understanding for human weakness. He seems unable to extenuate the culpability of man. Who could bear living in a state of disgust day and night? The conscience builds its confines, is subject to fatigue, longs for comfort, lulling, soothing. Yet those who are hurt, and he who inhabits eternity, neither slumbers nor sleeps. How do you live in the world? How do you live in a world with so much brokenness and not have it break you? We've read so far, the prophet is the person who feels fiercely, who answers the call, who refuses to go numb. Yet here Heschel is saying the prophets are unwilling to recognize our humanness and that we also need a break. The prophets can only see us from God's eyes, and God neither slumbers nor sleeps. But I'm not God, and I need to sleep. In my senior year of college, was deeply involved in a activist campaign that was meant to pull the University of California funds out of companies that did business with Sudan over the genocide in Darfur. One might not think that the University of California would have much invested in Sudan, but it turns out the oil and mineral resources there are tremendous, and many of the biggest companies in the world are deeply involved in funding that genocidal government. And I didn't really much go to class for a quarter and a half. I was fully invested in this campaign. And as much as I worked on this campaign, which did culminate, by the way, in millions of dollars being pulled out of these companies and the first systemic university-wide divestment campaign targeting the genocide in Darfur, as much as I worked, the person who was leading the campaign always somehow seemed to work 10 times harder. Somehow he never seemed to need to sleep. He never seemed to need to go to class. He never seemed to have any other interests. He only worked on this cause day and night. And every one of us were made to feel a little bad that we needed to sleep sometimes or go to class sometimes. And I remember this guy because, on one hand, I really idolized him. What an extraordinary model of devotion to a cause. And on the other hand, I found him ultimately demotivating because I could never do what he did. And so there was a temptation, if I couldn't live up, to drop out. How do we balance the fierce call of conscience and the need to sleep? I look to people in the screen. Quite a few of you are my elders who could teach me from some more years that you've lived in the world. How do you balance? How do you hold these two things without sleepwalking through the world, as the prophets insist we not do, and also while putting on our own oxygen masks? Yeah, please, Chuck.
I may not be interpreting the situation correctly, and I'm not making a criticism, but there's something that you might consider is you went beyond where you were supposed to go. You are not that person, so you seem to be trying to emulate someone who you are not. God made that person a little bit differently than you. And he is on his path, in his way, in his manner, with no sleep and no food and no air to breathe. But you are not him. And why would you try to give thought to deserting and leaving because you don't, quote, measure up to that person? I'm not saying you did that, okay? But I'm saying that the thought that I cannot be a rabbi of this congregation, but I'm not going to fail myself in life because I cannot be a rabbi of this congregation. So I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I think each person is in fact an individual. And from what I've studied, we'll take one person, myself. There is no one else in the billions of people upon this earth like myself. I am that unique. So in your uniqueness, and God's responsible for that, in your uniqueness, be the way you can be and on the path that you want to be, achieving what you want to be. But you always will fail to be someone who's higher, and you will always be superior to someone who's lower. So that's what that's it. I'm not sure what I just said.
I think you just gave me a therapy session, which I appreciate very much, Chuck. And you can send me the bill later on. Try to be yourself. I think what I'm hearing is when we watched, some of us who were in an earlier session, the interview with Carl Stern on NBC with Heschel. And Carl Stern says, "Are you a prophet?" And Heschel says, "I don't think I'm a prophet or even the child of a prophet, but I try to walk in their legacy." We don't necessarily need to be Jeremiah or Amos in order to be inspired by Jeremiah and Amos, and getting comfortable with the idea of a little bit of ego check. I am not Jeremiah. I am not Amos, and therefore I am allowed to go to sleep is healthy self-knowledge without taking it so far as to say, well, they'll do it for me. They'll do the work for me because I'm not them. So I don't have any responsibility here. And that's the danger. That's the danger is I will outsource my social responsibility to the hero rather than take up the piece which is mine to carry. Beth, it looked like you wanted to hop in.
Yeah. You know, as somebody who spent many years getting very little sleep and juggling a lot of balls and occasional grenades, I think what I would tell my younger self or that self is that boundaries are so important in life, and that people who you might see as being full bore committed and not being willing to sacrifice their sleep and their food and everything else, that it is the part of us that that measures ourselves against other people, that probably interferes with our sleep even more than doing more than we should, and that it's okay. I think it's that part of us that gives ourselves permission to be rested and alert, or to spend time with family and nature. And so one of Brene Brown, who to the best of my knowledge is not a great Jewish philosopher, but I think she said a lot of good things, says the opposite of belonging is not belonging, it's fitting in. And I think some of us who fit in really well struggle to find the boundaries, because we are always making ourselves available for whatever space other people are needing us to inhabit. So I don't think the other person was inherently more dedicated. And I think there would come a time when he will look back at you and say, I wish I had been a little more like Adam, because now I'm exhausted and I never really gave myself a chance to breathe. So that's my contribution tonight.
I'm also exhausted. Yes, right. There needs to be some concession to our humanness, and boundaries are not bad words. The prophets don't have boundaries. The prophets are boundaryless. They are boundaryless in their concern. They're boundaryless in their empathy. They're boundaryless in their outrage. And they can inspire us and activate us, but we do need to be cautious in how we imbibe them, because a little bit of human sympathy and a little bit of grace is also a balancing virtue. In Judaism, it's never all this. It's this and this, intention and conversation. Please, Rhonda and Hal.
I'm wondering, and I never thought about it until this conversation, but I'm wondering if those of us here and the prophets aren't complementary. Because the prophets, it's everything that we've read in the Heschel material. And we're talking tonight about our limitations, but it occurs to me that the prophets had limitations too, and that we serve each other as a result. Because the prophets don't deal with the day-to-day, but that we, as human beings, I guess, with our limitations, with our faults, etc., we deal with things and we see things that the prophets might not have been able to deal with. They set the ideal, we aspire to that ideal, but the way we aspire to it is to interact with each other and to interact with the community. It just seems to me that we might be complementary to each other.
Maybe if every one of us takes a piece of the puzzle, as opposed to needing to be responsible for the whole thing. It looked like Mitch was trying to hop in.
Yeah, can't
Yeah.
find the hand.
Mike, I have a question for you, Rabbi, and that is, you were relating your experiences with divestment of Sudan, and what leapt to mind was the BDS movement. And my question is, how do human beings know whether the cause that they support and they strive for is righteous? You felt that your cause was righteous. I think most people here don't think BDS movement is righteous. There are other kids in college who are as old as you are now, as old as you were, who think the BDS movement is righteous. So where do human beings turn to find out whether their efforts are righteous or misguided?
I think that having some measure of humility to recognize that we are not prophets, and if we're not prophets, then we're certainly not God, means that we can always get it wrong. And I think that what we're reading in Heschel might say back to us, you know what your conscience tells you. You know, everybody knows what their conscience tells them. And the best that you can do is to heed as well as you possibly can to that voice inside you. And does that mean that people are going to make mistakes, are going to be misguided? Of course it does. Does it mean that people are going to disagree about what the voice of conscience points them towards? Of course it does. But what's the alternative? The alternative is a sort of existential paralysis, where we say we can never know anything, and therefore we can never move at all. And so it is, you're absolutely right, an imperfect, conscience is an imperfect guide. It would be very nice if God would reappear at Mount Sinai and clarify all disputes and debates. But since God seems to be unwilling to do that, the best we have is this God-given conscience to try to do the best with. And certainly I'll say on that question about Sudan divestment and BDS, that was still a very alive issue when I was in college. And I did quite a lot of work with the Jewish community to try to make clear the distinction of why we were so committed to a divestment campaign against an actually genocidal country, as opposed to one about whom it was untrue that it was genocidal, and that the clarity there to say this is actually the appropriate tool for the actual sin was actually quite important. I remember presenting this to a group of rabbis for their support, and there was some disagreement amongst the rabbis about whether Jews should be silent to anything that had divestment in the name. And the late, great Harold Schulweis, moral conscience very much of a generation, spoke up in that meeting and said, we need to be prepared to call out evil when we see it. And that was his guiding philosophy that led him to found Jewish World Watch, Jewish organization opposing genocide. He was a great hero of mine. His picture is right over there on the desk. He wrote a book called Conscience. That would be an interesting study. I see, Howard, your hand. We are really at time. Is it quick?
Let me unmute. Hi. Yeah,
Hi.
the whole thing reminds me of a quote from a Bob Dylan song called My Back Pages, where he says, uh, good and bad, I define these terms, quite clear, no doubt, somehow. But I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now.
A
I think
little
the
bit of
prophet's kind of on the first part of that sentence. And then we here dealing with the world as it is, not a kind of a normative world, but the actual descriptive world that we live in every day. We have to take that and figure out what's practical and what is practical within the limitations of our own existence and our capabilities as finite beings. Right? If you're infinite, everything can be perfect. You know, but not if you have a limited life and there's certain things you have to deal with. So I guess the question is, does it get so bad that it's pathological, or are we just talking about, or maybe we have survival issues that we can't get to the stage where the prophets are unless we can survive to do it. That's why it's not clear what good and bad are. It's quite situational,
So
in
I
my
think we
opinion.
need to be able to hold two things. We need to be able to hold the reality that we're human, that we're not God, and we're not Jeremiah, and we're not Amos, and we're not able to know perfect God-given truth or speak perfect God-given truth. A little bit of humility goes a very long way. And we need to be very careful not to let ourselves off the hook from that place too quickly. The prophets say that we need to not allow ourselves to go to sleep. Maybe we can sleep at night, but then we need to get up and do the work. Then we need to get up and speak out and make the kind of change that Abraham made as a student activist, that my Bubby and Zadie made as union organizers, that many of you have participated in making in your life, and many, many millions around the world are continuing to stand up in their respective challenges and do. The prophets do not want us, and Heschel does not want us to articulate the message that says, or to understand the message that says, this is their work, not ours, because we're not them. Wants us instead to figure out how much of this we can imbibe, how much of this we can take on. And it goes to that line from the Talmud that is quoted so much it has become a cliche and lost its power, but it is one of the deepest truths we have to offer, that it is not up to any of us individually to complete the work, but that does not get us off the hook from doing our best. It is not on you or me to fix the world entirely, and we are all individually and collectively responsible for doing everything that we can, and then pushing ourselves a little bit harder than that, because we have more capacity than we know. Thank you all. We'll see each other next week.